Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So, good afternoon. We're going to get started on this because we want to try to finish on time, in fact, a little bit early so we can get going. But I want to welcome you to this session. Rob's going to start it off, Rob Fatland from Microsoft Research, and Stephen's going to then go afterwards. So I'll just turn it over to Rob's in our eScience and our external research team and go through some of the examples that he's actually run across.
All right, thanks, Dan. My title is Adapting Environmental Science Methods to Public Policy and Decision Support. And this particular talk gets away from nuts and bolts of data and tools and more into, believe it or not, kind of sociology of the subject matter. And I'm actually doing kind of a warm-up talk for Stephen Stanley from the Washington State Department of Ecology, who will be talking next about a more kind of practical on-the-ground GIS-based presentation. So when I get done with this talk, then I'll be introducing him. And some of the themes that I'll be talking about here are citizen science and what I'm calling municipal science, which is sort of a practical application of scientific methods to problems that have to do with water management in your community and other related things that happen when people and the environment interface. We use the terms monitoring and decision support a lot in this space. And by monitoring, I simply mean keeping tabs on how things are going once you've set up some kind of structure to govern how you use natural resources with an eye towards keeping them sustainable. And of course, decision support kind of backs upstream to how you make those decisions in the first place about how to manage resources. So to frame the problem in the paper that I submitted for the proceedings, I kind of talked about different domains. There are technical domains, there are specializations in environmental science, hydrology, geomorphology, and so forth. And into this mix of different types of expertise, you will often find citizens who care about where they live, and in some cases, citizens who are off the grid and have issues to solve that aren't simply involving turning a tap on and off or throwing a light switch. In solving problems in that kind of space, generally speaking, we all do the most natural thing. We reach out for the tools that are at hand and we use them to solve the problem. And the downside of doing that is that you can often end up with a solution that's adequate for the problem you're solving, but not adequate to future problems that come along. So anticipating future problems is an important part of this. And generally speaking, the idea is to have a broader awareness of what other communities like yours can do. And therefore, your first thought would be, well, I'll just go on the internet and find out what other people are doing. But that presupposes that other people have already gone on the internet and written down what they're doing. And not everybody is fanatical about recording what they've done. Ask any programmer if they like to write code or if they like to write comments. And so we have this sort of broader problem. But if you back away from the problem and try and solve the sort of in an abstract kind of way, you can come up with solutions that don't actually hit specific details or solve specific problems, and so you have no way of knowing that you're making any progress. On the other hand, if you solve problems the other direction from very close in, then you can end up going down a blind alley. And so that kind of suggests that you could synthesize the two scales and try and solve a problem that's very specific, but try and solve it in such a way that it will be adoptable, reusable. Your solution will be findable by some other person in the same boat. So I'm going to suggest 3 solution ideas, which is kind of a vague way of saying, well, maybe this would be good. And these solution ideas will come up in this talk. The first one is taking an expert in the topic that you're interested in, let's say the geomorphologist who understands the structure of the rocks that your house is built on, and having that expert being available to contribute cycles, their brain cycles, because having an expert come into a situation often gets you miles and miles beyond what you'd be banging your head against if you were just trying to do it out of a library book. Secondly, speaking of library books, the internet is a repository for all things shallow, and the library has its own problems, so I'm going to suggest this idea of combining deep content that you would find in a library book with web accessibility. And then finally, there's a sort of social messaging issue that extends to broader sociological problems, sort of on a global climate scale, which is the idea that there is no us, them, it's all us. And you can say that to somebody, let's say a student. You can say there is no us, them in terms of the United States and another country, but you can also say to a student, or to anybody for that matter, there's no us, them in terms of you and a scientist. So the standard model is to say, we're here to learn about what the scientists do. An alternative approach would be to say, you're here, and whether you know it or not, you're perfectly capable of thinking in a scientific way, of becoming a scientist, even if that's not your main job. So the notion of instilling people with that idea is sort of my third little sandbox solution that I'll suggest. And as an addendum, I'll just read this verbatim. Peer review and interpersonal networking are crucial to geoscience. By geoscience, of course, I just mean environmental science in the sort of traditional sort of university research sense of going and making new progress. Peer review and interpersonal networking are crucial to that career path, and therefore must be available to citizen and municipal science as well, if those are going to function in the same way. Okay, so my work concerns environmental research, data, and tools. There's a list of verbs there about things that you can do with data. And we often ask ourselves, how is our work at Microsoft Research, and particularly in Dan Fay's group, providing these types of people, hydrologists and so forth, with the opportunity to collect and work with good, better data at new and larger scales. But you can't work on that problem without occasionally spending some time thinking about the sociology behind it, hence these remarks. So we have these sort of large-scale problems, climate change being the sort of the foremost one, and then you have everything that winds down to very specific ones, and I'll now introduce the problem I want to talk about, which is the water management of an aquifer, an area where you do not have municipal water service bringing in water from some well-defined, clean source. Instead, you have to pump it out of the ground. In that case, if you decide to start pumping out of your well, then things are fine as long as you pump at a rate less than the water is recharging that well. And if you happen to live on an aquifer with a bunch of other people, and one person is pumping more than they ought to, then they're causing problems for their neighbors. So you have this issue of sustainability. In particular, the study site that I'm interested in is on Guaymas Island. I'll skip over the rest of that for now, which is a little sort of 50-kilometer square island in near the San Juans. It's part of Skagit County. That's vertical scale of the county there. Let's see, I guess I could use the mouse, but I don't have one. Anyway, it's about 35 kilometers. So that's a little island there, and no water, so lots of well holes are drilled. And underneath those properties on that island, you find aquifers. And down by the coast, by the shoreline there, the aquifers are freshwater, and they kind of rest on top of salt water, so that if you were to pump them out quickly, then you have this common problem in coastal areas, which is saltwater intrusion that makes your water undrinkable. So Skagit County regulates Guaymas Island by means of something called a sub-area plan, and that's a bunch of documentation about how we should and we could and we will and we ought to keep things sustainable on this island. But the people who live there, and notably a person named Mariana Kuiman, are interested in revising the sub-area plan, which was last revised back in, 1970 or something like that, to reflect sort of more modern standards on it. So great. What she did was she went out and made friends with everybody on the island and got their permission to go and measure their well depths. And she still had the problem left over, though, of getting an absolute depth to the water table, and the way to do that is with a GPS receiver. So that yellow box there is a $5,000 piece of hardware. It's not something that your local citizen scientist is going to be able to go purchase. What do scientists do? Well, we just ship equipment around through the mail all the time. So I showed up with this, and we set up that little white antenna on top of a bunch of wells, and we collected a bunch of data. And that data is expensive to process yourself, but fortunately NOAA has a service called Opus in the cloud. You send the data up to Opus, and it sends you back the results. So the results of this piece of the work were to generate an equipotential surface for the water table, for the top of the aquifer in the center of the island. And the bottom line of what you're seeing here is that's a contour map, and the dark red is sort of in the center left is the high point of the aquifer as we measured it. Now, that doesn't mean you couldn't go back and do it again and get a different answer, but with this one study that we did, which was a fair amount of effort, particularly on her part, we got a total dynamic there from the yellow to the red of about 10 centimeters. So that's a sort of if you think about a very flat, shallow, upside-down lake that's 10 centimeters high, that's what you're pumping out of. It's buried in the rock, several hundred feet below the surface of the ground. And then the actual absolute height of that equipotential surface, that water surface, is about 30 centimeters above mean sea level. So that's some fresh water that's floating there. It's recharged. The high point sort of suggests where the recharge area would be, and that could impact future decisions on where you allow people to build parking lots, because if you build parking lots, then the ground becomes less permeable and it's harder to recharge aquifers. You're diverting water that's coming down off into elsewhere, where you want it to go in the ground. So I've covered what we see. This aquifer, I should mention, is in the center of the island, but maybe coupled to the other ones that are more along the coastline. So you want to address issues of groundwater overdraft, saltwater intrusion. These are the two sort of known threats. And that's in addition to things like, is my water drinkable? And is there high concentration of heavy metal ions in it, and so forth. So this is sort of the process that the citizens on that island, particularly Mariana, are taking upon themselves to understand so that they can give feedback to the county, and then that will turn around and come back as a governing document for them. It also leaves open the question of how do you monitor that aquifer in the future to make sure that the policies that you put in place are effective. Okay. So now I'm going to sidetrack off into the notion of, well, what if I'm a citizen scientist and I did my well study and I want to go find out more? So I want to find out, for example, what the local water balance is like. How much precip am I getting in my area? How much water is running out through the streams? All that kind of stuff. If I'm interested in this, if I'm a sort of a curious person, then I might have the thought, well, I could go off into the government archives and find out what kind of data the government has for me, and I'll just study up on that. So what you would need is a search engine, and neither Bing nor Google will reach into government archives. However, it is possible to write something like that. In fact, Bora Baran of Microsoft Research built just such a search engine. It's called SciScope, or alternatively SkyScope. And it's currently available on the web, and it's also released in sort of an open source format, so you can stand up your own if you like. And I'm not going to belabor this too much. We've talked about it a fair amount in the past, except to describe how, as a curious person, you would go and find government archive data on water discharge. So I've gone here and I've entered some search parameters and hit go, and it's returned me some orange dot hits. That's where data is available from, in this case, the U.S. Geological Survey. And from one of those sites, I'm allowed to find out what the name of the site is. It's the Hoh River in the Olympic Peninsula. And I can ask the system to go and grab the data for me for download. And when it does that, I am handed an XML document, which opens nicely in Excel. And that data, if you can't see it, is time series data starting from January 1st of 2000 and running through October 1st of 2009. So that's 9 years of data, or 10 years of data, right there. And the values in the right-hand column are discharge in cubic feet per second from the Hoh River. So fantastic. It looks like one data value per day, so there's a daily average of discharge. And I also get some metadata that tells me who collected this. It came from the USGS, and what the units are, and so forth. Okay, so great. You can go into the government archives either directly through their portals, or you can use a tool like this, and you can get the data. And here it is again. This is just discharge, and in the C column, I did a cumulative sum so that I could also watch what happens every year in my total discharge. And you could look for annual trends this way. And then in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years go by, you can see if your annual trends are changing. And this would be another way for an interested person, either in a municipality or a citizen, to track what's going on with their water. So that's fantastic. However, When the other government archive is light on data, what do you do? So this kind of comes to that same problem that I alluded to before. I don't think I went into it, but the ratio of geoscientists to human beings on the planet is, give or take, approximately 1 in 14,000. If I go to that same government archive, well, actually I go to a different one, but I didn't know that because the SciScope interface just sort of agnostically goes to the right one and finds the data. But if I ask for how turbid the water is for that same river, I get one value over that same 10-year interval. So, and before I had one data value per day because somebody put a stream gauge in, but only one person went out to that stream and made a measurement of turbidity, and that happened on July 9th of 2003. So I get the same format data, including the metadata that tells me this is water turbidity in nephelometric turbidimeter units, and it has a value of 2.56. So that's one data value for 10 years. That's not very helpful. I can't make a plot out of that, not at least an interesting one. So it kind of echoes this geoscientist to humans ratio of 1 to 14,000, 1 to 14,000, or 500,000 to 7 billion is really the numbers. So what I'm sort of getting at here is that the approach of looking at larger problems like climate change, if you say, well, we have these geoscientists out there, they're going to sort of figure out where we're headed, and they're going to tell everybody, and we're all going to understand it, and we'll avert the disaster in time. This is sort of a big, interesting sociological and environmental experiment that we're running right now. And if you happen to be concerned about it, then that's the ratio you're trying to leverage, is 1 to 14,000 people. And that's kind of untenable in the same way that depending upon the government to collect a bunch of turbidity data on the stream that you care about is undependable. So the remedy for this is to bring in this idea that human beings are all capable of thinking scientifically and conducting scientific analysis. So it basically borrows from the left-hand column and adds more geoscientists on the right-hand column. It's wishful thinking, but it's an interesting thing to think about. Okay, getting back to finding solutions to problems. If you happen to live in a rural area and you are dependent upon your well for your water, how would you find out what Mariana Koyman did on Guaymas Island? Well, you'd go on the internet, but you would only find little fragments of solutions, perhaps. And if you did find domain-specific remarks on how to measure an aquifer and what aquifer hydrology is like, then you'll find hydrologists and geomorphologists using different terminology perhaps for the same thing. There's this big confusion of who says what about what, and people are inventing new terminology all the time, so that makes things even harder. If you cross from one rock unit to another one, the processes may be completely different, so that you can't really apply what somebody else wrote down if they did write anything down. So with 3 waves of the wand, I'll return to my solutions. The first one is the idea of experts contributing time. So if people who are experts in a field had, as part of their job description, spending time with citizen scientists to sort of convey what their local environment is like, what things they should watch out for, that would be a big contributor, and it would avoid people going down blind alleys perhaps and other pitfalls and sort of trying to figure it out for yourself. It would speed up your progress. And then I have this other sort of wishful idea that right now it's really easy to generate and create wiki content. People do it all the time. I've done it a couple times. The problem is that organizing information into sort of a book format with sort of deep content is really, really hard. It's a lot of work. It's just time consuming. And so authors can disappear for months or years at a time and write a book that ends up in the library. And people who like to dash off Wikipedia articles can dash off a Wikipedia article on the thing they care about. But the crossover between those two perhaps is some kind of book-like content that lives online. And I mentioned here Wikipedia. Also, Safari is a website that you can go to. You have to pay money to subscribe, but there you can see full book content. So that's a great way to be able to go if you can afford the Safari subscription. But then that third bullet over on the bottom right is the taxpayer, and that brings up an idea that that Jim Gray actually was an advocate of, which is as follows. If a researcher publishes a paper and that research is based on National Science Foundation's funding, which they often are if you look in the thanks to NSF for this grant, well, that means the taxpayers funded that research. and therefore a taxpayer should be able to have access to that paper without buying up subscription to Science or whatever. It should just be freely available online. So this kind of idea of openly available results of publicly funded research is I think, a nice one. And the taxpayer thing I'll come back to in a second. I want to mention also the example of the expert witness. That's the expert who goes and talks to citizen scientists or municipal scientists and says, look, here's what's going on in your local area. And it has to do back with the Guaymas Island thing. So Mariana Koyman, who I mentioned is sort of the advocate for getting a good policy in place, discovered that one of the other residents of the island, who goes nameless, wanted to purify water using this reverse osmosis purification process, which is very water intensive. So you would have to pump a lot of water to get a little bit of fresh water out. But he doesn't care because, he just doesn't care. So he was actually contemplating paying a expert person to come in to a public hearing and testify in such a way that he would win his case. So he was actually going to pay somebody to come in with their credentials and argue for something for his benefit. And this gets into this weird crossover between public process, where we tend to sort of argue for what we want and we hope we win. It's a litigious process, versus a scientific process where you sort of have this objective reality that you're trying to discover. So anyway, there's just something anecdotally interesting and complex about the whole process of bringing experts into the conversation. The third solution of my three kind of solution ideas harkens back to Washington State. According to Stephen, if you have a well that you're pumping 5,000 gallons per day or less out of, it's unmonitored, nobody cares what you do. And so if you have a bunch of people who have that limit, they could drill a bunch of wells and pull out as much water as they want to, and it's effectively drawing a lot of water, and you can have groundwater drawdown problems in an unregulated situation. So again, Steve will talk a lot more about regulation issues, and I want to make sure I'm done with this on time, so I'm going to rush to the end here. Okay, so social pressure is a possible way of getting to working together in a sustainable way. If you made real-time data about the aquifer available online, you could see what neighborhoods and communities were doing well with their sustainability and which ones were pulling too much water. And in thinking in the reverse way, if you had a good understanding of your water table, then you could also see places where you could pump more water from. Okay, so the last point here is what I alluded to earlier, which is the idea of the admonition that when you're growing up, you're told someday you'll grow up and have a job and you'll become a taxpayer. You could also think about other messages that come across to us as citizens. And the third solution here is to sort of imbue everybody with the notion of their own capacity to think as scientists and to be part of the sort of global community. It's something that we hear a lot. I just wanted to sort of, I guess, reiterate it. And now a couple of last little bits of humor or detail here. I was speaking to a municipal worker in an unnamed city who worked on stormwater, and I was describing the technology that I work on, sensors and so forth, and she sort of finished our conversation by saying, please don't give stream teams, those are citizen scientists, the technology to go out and generate a lot more data, because they're going to generate that data and then they're going to come and find problems and they're going to come to me and they're going to make my job harder. So that's an example of the kind of resistance that we have. So this is a slide about resistance. And then you have also the argument about what about a citizen scientist who goes off and finds some data and they completely misinterpret it and they get all excited and they jump up and down and they cause a lot of trouble and they take everybody down the wrong way. So there's this sort of concern about what if we change the way we're doing things? What if we start borrowing from that 7 billion person pool into the scientist pool? However, if you consider that this is my solution, the refinement or culling process in science says that if you start off in the blue dot over in the bottom left there and you do some work and you come up with a research result that's not very important, that's the lower path there, then nobody cares. So who cares? If, on the other hand, you do some research and you come up with a really big, important result, then everybody pays attention and everybody offers you resistance. They try and find out what's wrong with what you did. They try and poke holes in your argument. They try and come up with a better answer. And so that culls out a lot of that research result and it gets thrown out and they say, oh no, you're wrong, you're wrong. But if you manage to get through that resistance and you make it out the far side, that means that nobody can knock holes in your arguments, and so your piece of work gets carried through. So in a sense, you could say that having peer review in the equivalent world of municipal and citizen science could have a similar effect, and it would be an interesting thing to try and implement. So maybe I'll try and start a magazine of citizen science publications or something. Okay, so that's all I have, and I want to introduce Stephen before I burn all our time here. So there again are our troublemakers. It's Mariana and her husband. And now I'd like to introduce Stephen Stanley for the practical part of this talk. Stephen is a wetlands restoration ecologist with the Washington State Department of Ecology. And he's working to, if you don't mind the expression, overturn the existing paradigm in aquatic resources management. Let's do questions at the end, if that's okay.
Right. I won't turn it off. Okay.
I guess I should just go over here and open this up. Okay, which one's yours?
It should be that one.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm an aquatic ecologist that has worked in the governmental field for about 15 years, but I've also worked in the private sector, and I've worked a lot with universities and academics. What I'd like to talk about today is something that we're trying to undertake in Washington State, which is essentially an e-science approach. But one of the purposes of my talk, my objective today, is give you an idea about the difficulty of trying to accomplish that with governmental organizations and, of course, with the citizen rabble that we have out there presently. So I'm involved in a characterization of Puget Sound, which is funded by the EPA. It's a large area. We've got about 2,800 square miles of marine waterways, and I think everyone agrees in the governmental circles that we want to take a watershed approach to development in Puget Sound. And we were looking at a huge influx of people in the next 20 years. Probably over 2 million people will in-migrate if the economy approves, and I think it will. And we're going to be faced with a very significant impact on the aquatic resources there. And it is a very large and productive estuarine system. So one of the advantages of taking, when I say a watershed approach, is essentially looking at spatial temporal data over all ranges of data types and disciplines, and being able to integrate that in a way that we understand where are the best patterns for development. How can we avoid future impacts? And that has sort of been the history of regulated development in the United States, in Washington, that we fail to really anticipate those type of development patterns that result in very expensive solutions down the line. And flooding is one of those. I think we have tried to keep development out of floodplains, but in a lot of cases we haven't kept development out of floodplains. So in Washington, that last bullet there, we have a thing called the Growth Management Act and the Shoreline Master Programming Act. And those two pieces of legislation are designed to incorporate what they call best available science into the regulation, or at least put that in such a way that patterns of development will develop that will be appropriate. That being said, it's very hard to accomplish that in a lot of cases. I'm going to talk about that today, the reasons why we have difficulty. So the obstacles that we find is that this sort of collaboration usually requires scientists to get together from different disciplines. And typically they don't agree. And part of the reason is that there's usually a methodology and there's a system of knowledge that each discipline is going to have. And that system of knowledge usually incorporates, and I've tried to sort of enumerate those as you see up here. So we have precision, accuracy. I think those are probably the two key things that we deal with. A lot of times our scientists at the Department of Ecology really focus on the precision at which that data is gathered, but they might not design the experiments, so to speak, for all of Puget Sound, of what sort of question they're trying to answer specifically on a watershed basis. So the accuracy of their predictions about what is going to happen is probably not, it's not very accurate and it's not very predictive. So this is the problem that we face probably from the sublime, from science at its best, trying to bridge that gap with the public. We find with public agencies that a lot of times we're subjected to a situation where we have a very hard time explaining science to the citizens out there. And we keep approaching it in the same way. And I'm speaking principally for our scientists that I know at our department and other agencies within Washington. I've also worked in California with the California Coastal Commission. But there's a tendency, to a certain extent, I put it in this terms for scientists, not wanting to get involved in the public sector debate. So there's a big gap between the academic science and the research, and that's one reason I think e-science is so attractive, because we're trying to break that paradigm. We're trying to get scientists to actually involve themselves with the public and become better at explaining how you apply this watershed data and information. To explain to the public the uncertainty that enthusiastic user is going to go out and use that information in a way that will not be appropriate. They don't understand the fact that you have limitations on the spatial scales of that data. That you can't take broad-scale data and make predictions about a site-specific effect. And finally, the most important thing is this last bullet, developing practical solutions to environmental problems. And I know that's what e-science is all about, but that's where my focus has been for the last few years, that even though we have scads of data in the state of Washington for our various agencies, it's very scattered in terms of identifying practical solutions. A lot of it, especially water quality data, will focus specifically on what we call TMDLs. So TMDLs are total maximum daily loads that come out of the Clean Water Act. It takes a lot of time to develop these TMDLs. They're very expensive. They usually come up with a threshold, let's say for fecal coliform, that's allowed to be discharged within a particular watershed. And because of the time that it takes to put these together, there's only a few of these TMDLs usually within a complex ecosystem like Puget Sound. So you're not getting at resolving the sources or resolving the issue of where these sources really are and how you might approach limiting that discharge of fecal coliform to important areas. So to illustrate some of the problems, I know all of you here understand this, but I sort of wanted to go over how we might at Department of Ecology deal with this issue internally, because we're split up into siloed departments that deal with water quality, water resources, and shoreline development. So the scale precision doesn't match across disciplines. We find with hydrology, so hydrologists have a science which is based on a lot of empirical data. It's been tested probably over 100 years or more, and they can predict from a site scale or a small scale very accurately what river performance will look like in terms of its hydrograph. They can predict what the flooding level might be, and we know that there's very extensive program through FEMA that actually models what the floodplain will be, and we have an insurance program based on that. However, as we move into geomorphology, we find that there isn't, the predictive ability is not there. We have some very good models, but we don't understand the mechanistic relationship between each of those processes that's occurring out in the environment. And a lot of that's due to the fact that sediment movement's far more complex. Temporally, it occurs over much greater periods of time because it's usually looking at landslides that are occurring within a watershed, and that doesn't happen on a regular basis. We're looking at erosion in stream beds, and we're looking at bedload transport. All of those things are quite complicated, and we can't predict exactly what will happen over a long period of time. And ecologists, we get into sort of the hand-waving environment. We really can't make very good quantitative predictions, so most of it is qualitative. And when you're trying to come to a solution at the bottom, you need all of these things in order to come up with reasonable solutions to environmental problems that then can feed into planning in the state of Washington. So what we're attempting to do with this Puget Sound project, this characterization project, is that in essence we're saying let's use core scale mechanistic models. Now these are probably different from mechanistic models that most of you use in that we're actually using indicators in the environment that control the movement of sediment or control the movement of water. And we use, I'll show you a very brief sort of example of what this simple model looks like. And they're based principally on existing research that has looked at certain results are usually statistically based. So for example, a lot of work in Puget Sound has been done by Derek Booth, who has looked at land cover and looked at hydrographs and gotten to the point that we know, and you've heard this number, probably 10% of a basin that is covered by impervious surface will probably result in the unraveling of a stream system. And by that I mean that you get essentially a flume created because that frequency and velocity and duration of flows in streams is so great that it changes the complete substrate structure. You eliminate all of your niche habitat and you end up with a stream that virtually has no food chain in it. So we see that across the United States. We particularly see it in the Puget Sound area for many of the urban streams. So this process structure function, again, I know you're very familiar with this, but our modeling is saying we don't have the precision at the site level, the function level, but we do know the relationships that occur on a mechanistic basis at the broad scale. We know how sediment moves. We know basically what I should say. We know the things that usually govern on the landscape how sediment moves, how water moves, and how woody debris moves. And we know also that that has a very profound relationship with how the structure within a stream, for example, is formed. That movement of water, for example, if we're looking at that, is going to determine whether you get a pool and riffle sequence at a certain gradient. And that in turn determines the functions that are present. If you have a stream that is in equilibrium with its upper watershed, you're going to find that you'll have more habitat niches and you'll probably have more species richness within that system. So our assessment and our approach is to look at freshwater processes, nearshore processes, marine processes, what I'm speaking about, and fish and wildlife habitat. So we've actually formed a liaison with Fish and Wildlife Department in Washington and with our Department of Natural Resources, which is a separate agency. And we're using scientists from each of those to develop these core scale models, which then we're going to attempt the rest of this year and next year to integrate that information. And more importantly, the idea behind this, of course, is changing people's behavior. Those values in the middle, if we can assign values to that, but people feel that provides them either an economic incentive, we can change the threats and stressors, things like forestry, things like agriculture, which have huge effects upon processes. And of course, if we can change that, we can improve the structure and function. And we're hoping that we can actually restore a lot of the ecosystem in Puget Sound that's been degraded. So these, we have two models. This is for the water flow process only. It's a very simple model. You can see that it's basically mimicking the water budget. And what we've decided is if we could then model those controls on the landscape that govern how water moves, and we can divide it into delivery, movement, and loss, we can get a fairly good core scale model to tell us where are the most important areas within a hydrologic unit on the landscape. And once we know that, maybe we can decide, is this an area that we want to protect, or is it an area that we need to restore, or is it an area that we might want to recommend more development in? So we have things, we're using data from the Coastal Change Analysis Program that NOAA runs. We know that that data is going to come out every 5 years and will be brought up to date. We know that these data sets can give us relatively good ideas about where depressional wetlands are, which represents storage, and we can see the change in that wetland storage as we go along. And we have relatively good data about permeability that we can then use existing models that are there from the USGS about the rate of recharge. And then we bring a second model, which then looks at things that we know will impair those controls, that will change the way storage occurs on the landscape. And these are very general. We know if you have an urban area and you can lay that coastal change analysis program, urban density over there, you can get a relative value about how much that wetland storage might be affected. Again, it's not a precise number, but on a broad scale, it gives you a fairly good idea about what areas have been affected most for each of these controls. So then with those two models, we just put it into this simple matrix. And this is where I'm speaking to what scientists like yourselves are working on very precise models might cringe at, but this is what we really need in government, because the problem with a lot of the scientific input is scientists are not willing to say, absolutely, I think that the results of having this fecal coliform level and this development that's going in is going to result in this effect on the environment in the shellfish beds downstreams. Most scientists are unwilling until you've got empirical data to support that throughout that entire watershed to sort of sign on the dotted line. And that creates problems in a regulatory sense because you can never get to the point of actually getting a policy that will say, absolutely, you can't put that sort of development in that type of watershed because that's going to cause lots of problems. So we have this matrix that says, if you have an area in the upper right there that's high importance, it has a large percentage of those controls in it which allow that water flow process to operate, and you have a high degree of impairment, this is an area that you might consider restoring. And this is actually quite a different paradigm from how regulation has been approached before, or for the last 30 years, because regulation pretty much looks at areas that are degraded, especially wetlands, for example, under regulations, to be further manipulated, to be further destroyed, and really protection is the only thing that has sort of been set up. So with this matrix, it allows us to say, let's put development in areas that might be glacial till and bedrock and don't have a substantial benefit in terms of groundwater discharge and sustaining low flows, and protect areas that might have a huge role in providing recharge in an upper watershed. So this is the type of core scale tool that we're now giving to local governments, and they're beginning to use it. One of the things that we need, however, is the ability to take this information. So we might have water quality issues, we might have water quantity issues. We need to somehow have a group of scientists that can use their knowledge and experience to sit down in a room and say, well, what sort of solutions would be appropriate across these spatial scales? Because you really can't accomplish that with a model right now. We don't have something that's set up that sort of logic sequence to say what ifs given these conditions. So our idea is over the next 9 months, we have a group of scientists who will attempt to look at these disparate disciplines, if I can call them that, and then play that game in terms of saying, well, how would we recommend a particular solution in this watershed, or what would be the recommended solution in this watershed? So it could look something like this. We have a coastal atlas, or what we call a coastal atlas, that is an interactive ArcInfo type of website. 10 minutes, thank you. And right now we just map where wetlands are in there, what sort of conditions exist along the shoreline, so you can click on that shoreline and get air photos. You can tell where there's been landslides. So it's pretty static in terms of just showing you information but not telling you what you should do in a particular watershed. So our idea now is that you could click on this website. There's actually hydrologic units that you don't see the boundaries here, which range from about 2 to 3 square miles. And then you would get an index and you'd get a recommendation for that particular watershed based on the conditions. You'd also be able to drill down in that and get the information for that particular discipline, whether it's water quality, which presently is not readily available because it's scattered all throughout Ecology's website as well as other agencies. So the other thing that we need in Washington is that we don't have a consistent framework for going through these steps. We get a lot of local governments coming in that will essentially take the action at the site level and collect information, but they may be taking an action in the third box that's not informed by these previous two. So going systematically through and saying what are the conditions, what sort of solutions would be appropriate, and how do you interpret that in terms of the type of regulation, and then monitoring that. So here's an example of our two models. On the left, you're seeing the areas of importance. This is all normalized by area, so it's a relative comparison. We're not establishing any thresholds. We're just saying for this particular analysis area, this is what would be most important to the water flow processes. On the right, we have the impairment map. So we can combine those two with that matrix, and we get a map like this. So the darker yellows are your restoration. The greenish colors are where you might undertake protection, and the gray areas on the lower right are where you might locate development. So we have a lot of restoration areas here. Again, this is a relative recommendation. You have to decide as a scientist or a planner what you would do in that area. So that red circled area that you saw up there on the Canadian border, this is Whatcom County, is called Fish Trap Creek, and we have a problem of low dissolved oxygen. We know that what has been changed there based on the characterization is that we've got alterations to storage and delivery, and we know that these processes operate to drive denitrification and also removal of phosphorus through absorption. We know that depressional wetlands would assist in that significantly, but we've got to figure out an action. How do you get that to work in the landscape? So here we're looking at Linden, which is in that same circled area. This is the Fish Trap Creek, that bright yellow restoration area. So we look in there for a potential mitigation site. This is a very wet area, and a lot of the farmland, like this particular one that's potential wetland restoration, is not farmed. And this might be a potential site that you could restore. This is a roughly 2,900 acre watershed, so roughly 90 acres would be sufficient to remove, based on research done in the Midwest, about 45% of the nitrogen if it was strategically located within the watershed. So there's a nitrogen problem there. It's significant, and it's also impacting the nearshore area. What happens in Washington is the TMDLs focus on one stream, and they might not come up with a recommendation that goes beyond. There's no way to implement this sort of recommendation right now, and there's no connection with the marine areas. So there isn't an overall plan to say, well, how do we approach this to incentivize this? What you can do here, and I didn't explain that thoroughly, is that with the farm community, the incentive would be if you retire development rights on the edge of Linden, you give them money to set up a mitigation bank, and they're able to run that bank themselves. They can use the money from selling mitigation credits to buy farmland around Linden. And the reason I mention this is kind of one of the subtleties of dealing with agriculturalists, I know particularly in Washington, probably in California, is that if you don't provide some quid pro quo for the farm community, they won't cooperate in terms of providing any mitigation area. Right now, we're complete loggerheads with the farm community because they don't want to allow any mitigation. And the farmlands are really the area where we can accomplish probably most of the gains in terms of restoring these habitats. Okay, so now I'm going to skip over to Kitsap County, which is on the west side of Puget Sound, and we're going to focus in on that red circled area in Bainbridge Island. This is Illahee Creek, so I want to switch to a much smaller watershed. We're looking at probably a second order stream. It's well forested. It looks like it's got nice gravels in there. It's got good flows. Okay. And we applied our model, and one of the advantages of the model at this coarse scale, it actually can predict, in this case, where you might have high discharges. So the model said, based on slope wetlands and outwash deposits, that we would have good flows here. So when I went out this spring, we've done just a little bit of site testing. This is a slope coming down to Illahee Creek, and you've got a lot of discharge occurring there, which seems to reinforce the fact that this is a year-round flow, and it's also got some very good salmon runs on it. So that gives a prioritization. A lot of these coastal streams, you don't have data on their stream flows because there's just not enough money to do the type of sampling necessary. But a model like this, you begin to prioritize where you might put your money to mitigate. What's happening here, this is at the mouth of Illahee Creek. We've got a huge amount of sediment coming down. It's impacting the shoreline. It's preventing coastal access to that public dock because you're having a filling in. And we can see that we have degradation there, but restoration in terms of storage would be an important factor. In the upper watershed, what we have in that box area is residential that's been put in a historic wetland. So you've lost your storage capacity, there's a little bit left there. And what happens downstream with the salmon project, this is a common issue in Washington and I think elsewhere. Salmon recovery groups will go into what looks like a nice stream, put in this case, side channel habitat to raise salmon, and immediately the next year it was filled in with sediment. They didn't look at the landscape issue. They didn't look at the fact that they got bedload transport going on. So here's the recommendation here. The fact of the matter here is that you could probably retrofit this neighborhood. Very expensive, but Puget Sound right now has $48 million coming from the EPA to say, where would you do stormwater retrofit? So with this sort of core scale model, you can begin to sort of say, this is where we might undertake activities without spreading money all over the place. So real quickly, I want to talk about Issaquah. Just as an example of what does succeed, this was done actually in the 1990s. They used an HSPF model. It's a routing simulation model. And they were looking for practical solutions. King County was really way ahead of its time in the 1990s. They did some very remarkable basin plans. So their modeling showed not much surprise to that, to protect the upper watershed. There's a flooding issue in Issaquah, which has gone on for years. And they said what you need to do is remove the channelization, remove the homes in the lower watershed, and your flooding might be limited. The county turned around and adopted a really radical ordinance in the 90s based on this report and said limit clearing to 35% and limit impervious cover to 10% in the upper watershed. And because of the strength of this report and the fact that King County actually put out a plan and it had these clear objectives, they followed those 4 steps, it began to gain interest and money. So the city hired someone to write grants. The person who wrote grants has been able to pick up 117 acres in a city that have now pretty much been restored, so they've removed the floodplains. And then in addition, you got an incredible coalition of land trusts, the Mountains of Sound Greenway, and they began to put money into purchasing more properties, or I should say more actual trade-offs where they picked up lands that were privately owned and they put them into state ownership. So right now, plus those 10,000 acres, there's about 30,000 acres out of probably a 60 to 70,000 acre watershed in private ownership. And this map, again, the same color scheme, this is the mountainous area up here. You can see that after 20 years, it has remained pretty much protected. You get a low level of impairment, and that yellow area would be a priority for restoration. And this is the type of restoration activity the city has undertaken. They purchased the stream corridor, the upland area. They then went into, you can see that photo on the right is a channelized area without any pools and riffles, without any wood in it. They've installed woody debris. I was just out there this weekend with a class, and we actually saw salmon coming up it. It has a really nice asymmetrical channel now. So this was a good example of having objectives in place. And the reason it worked is because you had solutions that people valued because they wanted to stop the flooding. And you also had solutions that were also environmentally protective and met state law. So you had good cooperation at all levels, and you also had long-term involvement by key individuals at the local level. So that's all I have. We have a website. It doesn't have the data up presently that you saw for the characterization. That will be up in probably a month. And then at the end of the year, we hope to have it into that more interactive website. So, any questions? Thank you.
So the questions can be to both of you, right?
Yeah.
Hi, Jeff Dozier, UC Santa Barbara. So at the end of September in Redmond, and then yesterday at UC Berkeley, we've been having these workshops on data-intensive science and what NSF should do. And one of the principles that have come out of those workshops is the idea that the science community ought to be a little bit better about sharing data, and with the idea.
Speak closer to the microphone. Thank you.
Okay. So the question here is, there would seem to be big benefits for people being willing to share data, and particularly on the island. You know, the big part of the sort of human engineered hydrologic cycle that has the uncertainty are groundwater withdrawals. You know, that we can measure depths to the water table, but in trying to figure out the water budget and the ratio between precipitation and evaporation and recharge really helps if you can get data on withdrawals. And so one of the questions is, what would you do to get the people who have the wells be willing to provide flow data or pumping data? Now you can back that out if you have electricity meters on the wells too. So you don't need to actually have necessarily flow meters, but that's the big source of uncertainty.
Right. Go ahead.
I think it's a statement of a problem that's probably merits a lot further discussion, and I think are we out of time? Okay. So, but I mean, the first thing is that you have incentive to not report your water, how much water you're pumping out, because if you're in violation, then somebody's going to come and bother you. So you get slapped down for telling the truth. And so the question is, how can you reverse incentivize that, just as you're saying? And I think it's doable, but it's certainly not trivial. I mean, the Guaymas Island study I talked about, some people didn't want their wells measured. You know, it's just a very natural thing. I've got my property. This is the Wild West. You stay off my land. You go somewhere else. So, yeah.
Yeah, you saw the line up there about the Kitsap County approach to fecal coliform. And what the health district did there is they actually publish, though they did have it wasn't the person's name, you had a code, but you knew who you were, on who was polluting the most along Hood Canal. And Hood Canal has a huge BOD problem right now. And of course, septics are contributing to that. But it has worked to a certain extent in getting some people to clean up their acts, so to speak. The county provides money to go in and help people pump out their tanks or whatever. But I was saying to Rob, you know, maybe something like that needs to be done with wells, because wells are a huge problem washing out. And one of the things is it's actually in the permitting of wells they're exempt, these residential wells. So we have forced the development pretty much out into these outlying areas where you're getting a tremendous number of these exempt wells, and they're depleting the flow and streams. So another way I think to do it, if somehow at least people were required to provide this uplink and well level monitoring.
Yeah. So, should we call it there?
I'd like to point you to a project I'm working on in southeast Queensland called the Healthy Waterways Partnership. And it's doing something similar to what you're aiming for, primarily looking at water quality, not so much water quantity at the moment. And what they've done there is it's a consortium of 80 organisations and it's both state government, water agencies, regional councils, as well as community groups, as well as universities. And they've worked together to develop a very comprehensive and standardised ecosystem health monitoring program. So they've got data which is standardised for the last 10 years at the same sites. So you've got this longitudinal study. And based on that data, they're able to generate report cards. And those report cards can be used to convince both the local councils, the Brisbane City Council, and community groups where data should be, where money should be invested into particular resource management actions. And then more recently, we've been developing ontologies to link those resource management actions and the amount of investment to particular indicators at particular sites over a particular period. So the councils can see if we invest $5 million on riparian revegetation of the Bremer River, we're going to see a reduction in turbidity at these sites and an improvement in the fish species distributions at these sites. If we invest $5 million in wastewater treatment upgrade plant here, these are the parameters that will improve. And that seems to be working. But I think what's essential to these kinds of programs is developing consortiums where you have agreed monitoring standards, agreed sites, these comprehensive ecosystem monitoring programs over space and time that provides the evidence to underpin the policies and to convince governments and agencies to make particular investments. And then to show what's having an effect and what's not, and then to do your adaptive management cycle.
Well, that's excellent. I'd like to get the website for that. One of the things we've been seeing in Washington, Rob was alluding to it, is that we get faux citizen scientists. They come up and represent essentially the pro-development side, but they're very effective in disrupting the process because we don't have anything like you do that we can show decision makers that this really is the truth of the matter. But
I mean, it's not perfect. There's a lot of data that's missing and the modelling isn't perfect. And linking the data to the models to recalibrate them both based on real-time data is a problem. And also taking into account of events. So particular flood events might override any other resource management actions you've made because the flood washes a whole lot of soil down and the turbidity goes through the sky again. Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Great. Well, I want to thank you all for coming. Give Rob and Steve a hand.
Thank you.